Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Jeff Fortenberry. I represent the 1st Congressional District in Lincoln, Nebraska, and surrounding areas. We're grateful for your all willingness to spend a little bit of time with us today. And basically, the purpose of our meeting is to explore issues in the nuclear security cultural realm. How safe, how unsafe, where the holes are, in light of the upcoming Nuclear Security Summit that will take place in The Hague shortly. So we're very grateful to Henry Sokolsky, who will lead our discussion today. And Henry is the director of the Non-Proliferation Policy Educational Center. Charles Ferguson, Federation of American Scientists, Edwin Lyman, Union of Concerned Scientists, and Jody Lieberman, who's with the American Physical Society. So in the interest of time, Henry, do you want to just jump right in after Adam Schiff speaks? Adam and I have founded the Nuclear Security Working Group. This flowed out of a mutually shared concern that we are not sufficiently focused in Congress on the whole spectrum of issues affecting particularly non-proliferation, but nuclear security in general. As I like to say, we're all gravely worried about this existential issue and the future of civilization itself, but we just don't have the time. So, so Adam and I have attempted to form this working group as a de facto caucus in order to primarily heighten the intensity of awareness on the range of nuclear security issues, provide an additional platform for this discussion, and hopefully continuing to build, with some of your help, broader-based interest in these questions that are so gravely serious. As Sam Nunn said yesterday, we are in a race between collaboration or catastrophe, and that's the reality. And the problem with nuclear weapons is you cannot react to a catastrophe. It's too gravely serious. So we have to do everything we can to reduce the probability of their use to as close to zero as possible. So that's, I'm grateful for my colleague Adam, all of his diligent efforts in this regard before I came to Congress, and his partnership with us. Adam?
Thank you, Jeff. It's great to join with you and our colleagues today. I'm from an area much like Lincoln, Nebraska, Hollywood, California. and proud to join with Jeff in this discussion about how we can better protect ourselves from the potential of a catastrophic act of nuclear terrorism. As some of you may know, the issue of nuclear security has been uppermost in my mind since I came to Congress in 2001. And been working on this for more than a decade now to try to attract greater attention to the issue of securing loose nuclear material and safeguarding weapons technology and know-how. For much of that time early on, it was a lonely fight until I found my colleague in Jeff, and the two of us have been working on this ever since, and I want to thank him for all of his leadership. This is a bipartisan effort. We're all equally vulnerable, and there's no monopoly in one party or the other on good ideas about how to best secure ourselves from our most deadly creation. On the 24th and 25th of March, more than 50 countries are going to gather in The Hague for the 3rd Nuclear Security Summit. The aims of the summit are to achieve further reductions in the quantity of nuclear material in the world, to better secure existing material, and improve international cooperation in the field of nuclear security. We were privileged to participate in some of the events surrounding the inaugural 2010 meeting in Washington and followed the follow-on summit in Seoul with great interest. This year's summit and today's meeting take place at a time of high bilateral tension between the U.S. and Russia, tension that has caused concern over Russia's continued cooperation with New START inspections, even as it has served as an important reminder of why we cannot afford to ignore the issue of nuclear security and why it is profoundly in our self-interest to remove these arms control from the larger basket of U.S.-Russian issues. The stakes are just too high. Given the emphasis being placed on reducing the quantity of fissile material and better securing existing material at this year's summit, I've been dismayed by recent reports that our work with the Russians to secure loose nuclear material in the former Soviet Union has virtually been halted by the ongoing crisis over Ukraine and by the expiration of the agreement last June, in part over Russian concerns over reliability. Luger has been one of the great arms control success stories of the post-Cold War era and a bright spot in what has often been a very rocky relationship with Moscow. Before I turn over to our panelists for what I think will be a fascinating look back at the history of nuclear security. I want to note the fairly substantial cut in the administration's request for non-proliferation efforts in 2015, specifically large cuts to the Cooperative Threat Reduction Initiative and International Material Protection and Cooperation Program. While the administration has indicated that the cuts could be attributed in large measure to the slowdown of work in the former Soviet Union, I do not want to take any steps that could give the Russians an excuse to further roll back their cooperation or end the program altogether, and I'd be interested in the panelists' thoughts on that, as well as on the implications of the violation of the Budapest Memorandum and the broader impact that will have on efforts in non-proliferation. And with that, I will turn it over to Henry to begin our discussion.
Okay. This panel represents most of the authors and some of the commentators for a book that you can find on the web, on our website, which is www.npolicy.org. And I suppose we can pass this around. It's the only copy I have. The United States Army Strategic Studies Institute, your tax dollars working, because of sequester, couldn't quite meet the deadline. So we thought we'd have this event and put it on the web, and eventually it'll be free for anyone who wants it. Sir, why don't you pass that around? I like to say that nuclear security is the optimist club. So the problem is just securing what we know about. But this book is to show that there is a bottom beneath the bottom that you thought you had discovered. And the bottom beneath the bottom of nuclear security is material unaccounted for. You cannot secure that which you do not know where it is or how much it is. And therefore, this is a blast from the past. This man worked for Senator Roth when I worked for Senator Humphrey.
Wow.
And I don't mean Gilbert, I mean Gordon. So this is real history. All right. Now, what we thought we'd do, this is the two-part project. The first part of the project was to put proper nouns on nuclear weapons incidents where control of nuclear weapons resulted either in their use, in the case of the Chinese Cultural Revolution, it's not well known, but one was fired off through loss of control, or nearly. Well, of course, in the case of Algeria, there's a little bit of debate whether it's an act or not. But there have been incidents where loss of political control has produced something more than a broken arrow. The assumption always is that the United States is the one we have to worry about. But, you know, my take on that is if it's just the United States, there's nothing to worry about. We can deal with it. You don't have a multilateral gathering to worry about American lost nuclear weapons. It's got to be at least a few countries. So the first book, and you can get that on the web, is about nuclear weapon security crises in Pakistan, France, Algeria, China, and Russia. This volume is about material that went unaccounted for and what we can learn from history. Roughly, I will summarize one of the chapters of a book where the author could not come, Victor Polinsky. And the title of his tells you one of the bottom lines of the book, which is not very cheery. And that is, sometimes major violations of nuclear security get ignored. The point of this chapter is, after listening to these other authors explain how much stuff we couldn't find, I think you said 6 tons.
6 metric tons.
6
yeah.
metric tons. We'll listen about the civilian sector, it's not quite that much. It's hundreds of kilograms. You know, we go on down. The new bottom beneath the bottom of MUF, or material unaccounted for, is this chapter, which says, and even when we find out about things missing, we ignore it. The reason we ignore it is different in each case, but the cases that Victor looks at is Israel, where roughly 330 some odd kilograms of material was stolen from the United States and ended up in Israel, as best we can tell now. We did not talk about that. That was not one of the investigations that was publicized in a big way, and it wasn't one that got completed. There, we can well understand why. I mean, I personally have many trees planted in my name that have been cut and burned down with love, I'm sure. And we have a connection with Israel. So we don't talk, and we did not have an easy time talking about that theft. But there were other cases, Pakistan, North Korea, and India, where we had asked them not to do certain things, and we were taking accountings of material, and we knew certain things were going on. And in the end, we largely overlooked it in most cases. I mean, North Korea may be an interesting case where we finally acted, but it took a long time. And I think the takeaway here is, if you're going to feign ignorance about violations in the nuclear security area, getting better nuclear security might not carry you across the finish line. And if we look back, things don't look great. And presumably the Doppler shift that you're looking for is not technical or having to do with funding. It's something much more basic. So I thought we'd start with the worst first, and then you'll hear about less than the worst from the others. And then perhaps we can talk a little bit about the kinds of things you're talking about, which is, well, what do we make of what we should be doing now? What is contingent that might matter and give us more traction on a whole host of things related? Does that sound like a plan? Okay. Now, there ought to be an order. Let's start with the worst case. In other words, we go from really bad to sort of bad to less bad to better and better. How's that? You're next.
Right.
Now, does he need an introduction?
I don't think so. I don't know.
He's the head of the Federation of American Scientists. And that organization is dedicated to going down, right?
We are. Right.
Okay.
Yes.
By the way, there are not too many organizations that are openly arguing for going up. So
Right.
you want to go down really far.
In a responsible way.
In a responsible
Right.
way.
We're not part of Global Zero per se, but we'd like eventually to get down.
See,
low.
I think if you drink hard and heavy with him, he lusts in his heart. Go
I
ahead.
do.
Go
Right.
ahead.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't take, you don't take water to get it out of it. Right.
Go ahead.
So, yeah, this started well over a year ago. Henry was trying to find someone to write this chapter, and I won't mention a colleague who just didn't have the time to do it for various reasons. So I got picked, and I've enjoyed working with Henry over the last, 12 or 13 years, and various jobs I've been in, and I think this is probably the third or fourth chapter I've written for him. And it was challenging because at first we didn't think we would find much, but Henry found a few documents in his files. I ferreted a bunch of stuff out on the internet, and then Henry's also alluding to some work that Victor Galinsky has done in recent years, looking at material that allegedly was stolen from a facility in Apollo, Pennsylvania, the NUMEC facility in the 1960s, and allegedly made its way to Israel. So I could try to just touch on it very briefly at the end, because Henry asked us not only to spend roughly 5 minutes each, because we have various.
His assignment was muff in the
military
military
sector.
sector in the U.S.
Right. So I looked at not just nuclear weapons program material, but also naval fuel as well, because that's important, because the one thing I just mentioned about the NUMEC incident comes from the naval fuel production part of that sector. So if you look at, and Henry already said this, if you look at the amount of material unaccounted for in all the military production of fissile material from the 1940s until 1991, when the U.S. stopped making fissile material for military purposes, you have about 6 metric tons of fissile material that we can't account for.
How many weapons were inside? It's hard to tell.
It's hard to tell, but I say it's at least enough for several hundred nuclear explosives, or maybe more. You have Tom Cochran here, and he would argue, well, you could probably get even more out of that if you know how to really design these things.
The high hundreds.
High hundreds.
High
Yes,
hundreds.
right.
Okay.
How do you lose 6 tons of this material?
Well, that's just what his paper's
boom,
about.
This is the next. Fort Berry, thank you very much. That's the next point. What's the conventional wisdom? I think here's what you typically hear, and I'm going to quote from a Comptroller General report. What was then known in 1978 as the General Accounting Office, GAO, and they say for the most part, material unaccounted for is attributed by DOE and NRC, Nuclear Regulatory Commission, to such things as inaccurate measurements, difficult to measure material held up in pipes, filters, and machines used in processing special nuclear material. And the other main reason given was clerical errors. Man, the clerks are always getting it on the chin. So is that true? Well, maybe, but pull back the curtain, and we've seen time and again over the last 40, 50 years, various government reports, Inspector General reports, GAO reports, etc., sounding the alarm that the accounting system is just not adequate. It's not meeting the U.S.'s stringent standards. And we do know that one significant case of alleged insider diversion we'll touch on at the very end. So if, and Henry said, well, a little bit of leading the witness when I was going through an earlier draft, he said, well, Charles, if that's the case, if the U.S. material accounting system is not that adequate, or not adequate enough, what does that say about other nuclear armed states and their accounting systems? Because if we look at Russia in particular, and Congressman Schiff mentioned the tension with Russia, the Russians remanufacture their nuclear weapons a lot more frequently than we do. So there's more opportunities, more chances for material to go missing in the Russian production facilities because they're reworking the weapons production more frequently. India and Pakistan, as Henry said, Victor Galinsky looks at those two countries in particular. There are concerns that there are still relatively new nuclear armed states. It's likely they don't have nearly as good of an accounting system as even we have. So that's something to keep in mind. If the U.S. isn't quite meeting its standards, what about the other states? Well, we produced a lot of stuff. We produced a lot of fissile material over the years. Our country is great in the sense that we're pretty transparent. You think back in the early part of the Clinton administration, Hazel O'Leary, remember as Secretary of Energy, came in the openness initiative. We're gonna publish what we know about the highly enriched uranium stockpile, the plutonium stockpile. It took a long time to do the accounting, and these reports eventually came out, and what we found out was 740 metric tons of uranium was produced over those long decades of production. And there we have roughly, almost 4 metric tons worth of highly enriched uranium that we can't account for. And with plutonium, it's not as much, because you don't need as much plutonium per bomb for a bomb as you do for highly enriched uranium. So we didn't manufacture as much plutonium as we did HEU. We manufactured just under 100 metric tons of plutonium. And there we have about 2.5 metric tons that we can't account for. And another important point to point out, and I don't want to get lost in all these numbers, is there were 2 plutonium inventory reports that were published. There was one published in the mid to late 1990s, and then about 10 years later, no, actually not that long ago, about 2 or 3 years ago, so it was almost 12 years later, there was a follow-on report published. And, well, lo and behold, now the material unaccounted for has gone down. It went down by 0.4 metric tons. Well, what happened? Well, the DOE says they did a more thorough inventory check. They went through the Rocky Flats decommissioning. They're going through material at Hanford, 2 locations where we have a lot of fissile material, and they were able to account for another 0.4 metric tons. Well, I point out that the relatively large change in the total inventory and what are known as inventory differences or material unaccounted for, and the continuing uncertainties in knowing what's accounted for, still raises the possibility of diversions of fissile material in the past and in the future. Now, I'm not saying all this stuff went missing, or even the vast majority of it went missing. It's probably true. Clerical errors, stuff stuck in piping, etc. But still, there's enough there to raise concern. And another important point, which Tom Cochran pointed out when he reviewed a final draft of this paper, is that if you look at the statistical distribution of this material unaccounted for, what you really want to look at is what's the absolute value, what's the total amount of material you're looking at per facility, and does it cross the threshold of a significant quantity of material enough for at least one or more bombs. And Tom makes a good argument that if you look at those trends, there's you have reason to be suspicious that there could have been opportunities for diversion in a number of places. I'm not saying we have evidence that this actually happened, but still, with the vast, complex material production we have, it's possible that things could have been diverted over the many decades of the production and manufacturing processes. I don't know if my time's short, so I'm going to keep moving on here. Implications, exactly. Thank you very much. So, as like you tell,
why do
we care? Right, exactly. So, it's the main threat we're worried about is the insider threat, and so employees, management at these facilities. So let me just touch on this the new MEC case, and then I'll conclude with a few takeaway items.